The first howl cut through the night like a blade, pulling her from a shallow, restless sleep. At first, she thought it was only one, maybe two, far out in the timberline. Then came the second and the third, and by the time she sat up and swung her feet to the floor, the sound had multiplied until it was a full chorus, layered and echoing in the still, cold air. She grabbed the lantern and lit it with trembling fingers, the flame flaring to life and casting a warm glow over the cabin's single room. The window panes were fogged, but through them she could see shapes, dark, low forms moving against the snow. Her breath caught. Wolves. Not 2 or 3, but a full ring of them, 10 at least, pacing just beyond the edge of the lamplight, their eyes catching the glow like tiny amber coals. Her hand went to the rifle leaning by the door, the wood cold under her palm. She'd heard of wolves taking livestock in the deep winters, but she had no stock left, nothing to draw them. Except her. She moved slowly to the window, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The wolves weren't attacking. They were waiting. Every time she shifted, they shifted too, never breaking the circle. Then her eyes fixed on one, smaller than the rest, thin-legged, fur patchy in places. It wasn't pacing. It was standing perfectly still, head low, staring straight at the cabin. When she took a step toward the door, it took one forward too, closing the distance between them with a slow, deliberate gait. That was when she saw it, something tied around its neck, glinting in the lantern light. She froze halfway to the door, torn between instinct and a pull she couldn't name. The little wolf stopped at the bottom of her porch steps, steam rising from its breath in the freezing air. Its tail was still, its gaze steady, and for the first time she noticed there was no snarl, no threat in its eyes. Just purpose. She gripped the door latch, the weight of the rifle in her other hand. Something deep in her gut whispered that this moment mattered, that if she turned away, she'd regret it forever. Slowly, with the wind pushing cold fingers into the room, she opened the door. The wolf didn't flinch. It stepped closer, the rope around its neck swaying, and she saw it clearly now, a scrap of worn leather holding something small and folded. She didn't breathe as she reached for it. Her fingers brushed damp fur, and the little wolf didn't move. She untied the pouch with clumsy hands, opened it, and saw a single slip of paper. Her heart stopped. It was her son's handwriting. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the paper. The edges were damp from the wolf's breath, but the writing was still clear. The letters rushed and uneven as though written in the dark. "Mama, I'm alive. Don't trust anyone in town. Follow them." She read it twice, her pulse thundering louder than the wind outside. Her boy had been gone for 5 months, vanished after setting out to sell firewood in town, and every day since had been a dull ache of fear and unanswered questions. Now, in the middle of the night, surrounded by 10 wolves in the middle of nowhere, his voice had reached her again through ink and torn paper. The little wolf stepped back, as if it had done its job, and turned its head toward the tree line. A sharp, almost impatient yip broke from its muzzle. The rest of the pack shifted, their pacing slowing, heads all angling toward the same stretch of darkness beyond the cabin. She felt the cold air on her face, smelled the sharp scent of pine and frozen earth. This was madness. Following wolves in the dead of night was a story that ended in teeth and blood, but the note crumpled in her hand said otherwise. And her son. Her son had always been right about animals. She grabbed her coat from the peg, stuffed the rifle into its sling, and stepped out onto the porch. The crunch of her boots on the snow seemed deafening compared to the soft pads of the wolves moving just ahead. As she pulled the door closed behind her, The smallest wolf started off at a steady lope, the rest breaking the circle to fall into a strange formation. 2 at her sides, 4 ahead, 3 behind. She realized with a start that they weren't guarding against her. They were guarding for her. They moved fast, but never so fast she couldn't keep up, weaving through narrow stands of spruce, over drifts that caught the moonlight like spilled sugar. Every so often, the smallest wolf glanced back to make sure she was there. Somewhere deep in her chest, something shifted from fear to trust. But as the trees thickened and the shadows closed in, a new sound broke the rhythm of her breath and the wolf's pause. Voices. Faint at first, then sharper, a man laughing, another muttering curses. She froze, crouching low. The wolves did too, silent and still. The smallest one eased forward until it was just ahead of her boots, then growled so low it felt like the ground itself was rumbling. Her boy was out there, somewhere beyond that sound. And someone else was, too. The voices grew clearer with every step, carried through the pines on thin strands of smoke. She crouched behind a fallen log, breath coming in sharp clouds, the note from her son damp in her pocket. The wolves melted into the shadows, their fur blending so perfectly with the snow-patched undergrowth that only their eyes betrayed them. Ahead, a small fire flickered in a clearing, ringed by 2 men wrapped in heavy coats. One sat sharpening a knife, the steel catching the firelight with every pass. The other held a rifle across his knees, tapping his boot against the frozen ground in a lazy rhythm. She leaned forward for a better look, and that's when she saw it. Near the fire, lashed to a crude wooden frame, was a small cage. Inside, curled on his side, was her boy. His hair was longer, his face thinner, but she would have known him anywhere. Her breath caught in her throat, a noise she couldn't hold back. One of the men's heads snapped up, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. She froze, her heart pounding so hard she thought they'd hear it. The wolves stayed utterly still, only the smallest shifting slightly, pressing its side against her boot like an anchor. The man with the knife muttered something and stood, scanning the dark. The one with the rifle smirked. "Coyotes," he said, spitting into the snow. But his gaze lingered on the shadows. The smallest wolf stepped forward, silent as falling snow, its head low, gaze fixed on the man with the rifle. She knew then that this was no chance meeting. These wolves had brought her straight to the ones who'd taken her son. Every instinct screamed at her to rush in, to tear the cage open and wrap her boy in her arms, but she knew she wouldn't make it 3 steps before they dropped her where she stood. The wolves seemed to sense her hesitation. The largest in the pack, a gray with one ear torn, shifted position, drawing the men's attention with a low, deliberate growl. The men stiffened, eyes flicking between each other. "Looks like supper's come to us," one said, reaching for his rifle. In that heartbeat, the smallest wolf glanced back at her, and she understood. This was the moment. The pack wasn't just going to guide her. They were going to fight for her. And if she moved now, she might get her son out alive. She tightened her grip on the rifle, heart thundering, and waited for the first wolf to strike. The torn-ear gray lunged first, a blur of fur and muscle breaking from the shadows. The man with the knife shouted in surprise, stumbling back as the wolf's weight slammed into his chest, knocking him into the snow. The rifleman swung his barrel up, but before he could aim, 2 more wolves hit him from the side, snarling, their teeth snapping inches from his face. The clearing exploded into chaos, men cursing, wolves growling, snow flying in every direction. She didn't wait to think. She bolted from behind the log, the smallest wolf at her heels, straight towards the cage. Her boots slipped in the churned snow, but she didn't stop until her hands gripped the rough wood of the frame. Her boy's eyes went wide, his lips parting in a whisper. "Mama," She fumbled at the rope binding the cage door shut, fingers numb from the cold and the rush of adrenaline. A shot rang out, the crack shattering the air. A wolf yelped, not the smallest, thank God, but the sound only seemed to make the pack more ferocious. One of the larger wolves leapt at the man with the rifle, jaws locking around his forearm. Blood bloomed against the snow as he screamed, dropping the weapon. She ripped at the rope until it gave, the door swinging open. Her boy tumbled into her arms, lighter than she remembered, his body shaking. "Run!" she breathed, pushing him toward the gap in the trees. The smallest wolf darted ahead of him like an arrow, cutting a path. She turned back just in time to see the knife-wielding man break free from the gray wolf's hold, his face twisted with rage. He lunged for her, blade flashing. She barely had time to raise the rifle, not to shoot, but to block, when another wolf, dark as midnight, came from the side and slammed into him so hard the knife spun into the snow. He hit the ground with a grunt, the wind knocked out of him. "Go!" the gray barked. Or maybe it was just her own mind translating the urgent snarl. She spun and ran, the sound of the fight chasing her into the forest. Behind her, gunfire cracked again, and the night filled with howls. Her son stumbled once, but she caught his arm, pulling him forward until the trees swallowed them whole. They didn't stop until the wolves regrouped ahead, leading them deeper into the dark, away from the fire and the men who had thought she'd never come. They didn't slow until the orange flicker of the fire was long gone, replaced by the silver glow of moonlight on snow. Her breath came in ragged bursts, each one cutting her throat like ice. She clutched her boy's hand, afraid that if she let go for even a second, he'd vanish again. The wolves moved in a loose V-shape ahead of them, the smallest keeping close to the boy's side, brushing its shoulder against his knee like a guardian. Somewhere in the distance, a single howl rose, long and mournful. The torn ear gray answered, and the sound vibrated in her bones. She realized then it wasn't just a call, it was a signal. The boy stumbled but didn't stop. "They kept me in that cage for days, Mama," he whispered, voice hoarse. "Said they were waiting for someone." She wanted to ask who, but before the words could form, the smallest wolf's head snapped up. A low growl rippled through the pack. The air shifted, not colder but heavier, carrying with it the faint tang of smoke. She scanned the trees and saw it, a faint, flickering light between the trunks ahead, not fire like before, but the dull red glow of lanterns swinging in the dark. And then, voices again, different this time. Low, purposeful, and too many of them. The torn ear gray turned to face her, eyes sharp as flint, and stepped closer until its breath misted in the air between them. It moved its head in a slow, deliberate nod toward a narrow gap in the trees off to the left. She understood. They wanted her and the boy to break away, to vanish into that path. But she hesitated. "If we run now, they'll follow," she murmured. The boy's grip on her hand tightened. "These aren't the same men, Mama." His tone carried something she hadn't heard from him in months, fear sharpened by recognition. She looked again at the lantern light. The figures were moving closer, and in their hands were long, curved rifles she hadn't seen since the old wars. Whoever they weren't here to save anyone. A sharp bark from the smallest wolf jolted her into motion. She pulled her boy toward the narrow path, heart hammering, while the rest of the pack fanned out between them and the approaching lights. The snow swallowed their footsteps, but the sound of the wolves' growls behind them told her one thing. This wasn't over. They'd escaped one trap only to stumble toward something far bigger. They moved fast through the narrow path, branches clawing at her coat, the boy's breath ragged beside her. The wolves stayed behind as a barrier, but their growls grew sharper, more urgent. She kept glancing over her shoulder, catching flashes of their fur in the moonlight, and behind them, the faint bob of lanterns weaving between the trees. Whoever was following knew how to move quietly. The only sound was the crunch of boots when they stepped off packed snow. Then came the first whistle, short, sharp, rising at the end. The boy flinched. "That's how they called the traps," he whispered. Before she could ask, a metallic snap cracked the air, followed by a yelp from deep in the pack. The smallest wolf stopped, turning back toward the sound, but the torn ear gray barked once, commanding it forward. Her stomach twisted. These weren't just men looking to kill. They were hunting the wolves one by one. A shadow slipped through the trees ahead, and her breath caught. Not one of the lantern men. This figure was crouched low, wrapped in pale fur, a bow drawn. The arrow's head glinted silver under the moon. It was aimed straight at the smallest wolf. Without thinking, she swung the rifle up and fired. The shot split the night, echoing off the trunks. The figure vanished behind a tree, the arrow clattering harmlessly into the snow. The boy stared at her, eyes wide. "Mama." She grabbed his hand and pulled him forward, running harder now. The path sloped downward, the snow slick beneath their boots. Somewhere ahead, water rushed faintly under ice. The torn ear gray loped to her side, its flank brushing hers, steering her toward the sound. Another whistle pierced the night, answered by a deeper one to the left. She realized then they were being funneled. The hunters weren't chasing. They were herding. Her heart pounded against her ribs, the weight of the rifle suddenly heavier. She didn't know if these men were after the boy, the wolves, or her. But she knew they wouldn't stop until one of them was gone. The smallest wolf darted ahead, tail high, disappearing around a curve in the path. A beat later, its sharp bark echoed back, urgent and sharp, a warning or a signal she couldn't tell. But she tightened her grip on her boy's hand, because whatever waited around that bend was going to decide whether they lived through the night. They rounded the bend, and the forest opened to a wide, frozen river, its surface shimmering under the moonlight like glass. The current beneath whispered in a deep, relentless murmur. The smallest wolf stood at the edge, paws shifting nervously, tail rigid. The torn ear gray trotted up beside it, scanning the far bank where the trees were thicker, offering cover. Behind them, the whistles came again, closer now, in different pitches, like a language of the hunt. Her boy's grip tightened until his small fingers ached in hers. "Mama, they'll see us," he whispered. He was right. The ice reflected every shadow, every movement. If they stepped out there, they'd be nothing but silhouettes under the moon. The torn ear gray gave a low, rumbling growl, stepping onto the ice with careful, deliberate strides. It turned its head back toward her, eyes sharp. Move now, or be caught. She pulled the boy forward, boots sliding on the slick surface, her heart thudding in her ears. The wolves spread out ahead and behind, their paws silent but their presence steady, guiding them across. Halfway to the center, the first shot rang out. Ice chipped near her boots, splintering white shards into the air. She gasped, pulling her boy lower as the wolves bolted forward in bursts of speed, zigzagging to make harder targets. More shots followed, echoing in the still night. The smallest wolf barked sharply, circling behind them to nip at her coat, urging her faster. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Figures emerged from the tree line, lanterns abandoned in the snow, rifles raised. One hunter knelt, taking careful aim at the torn ear gray. She swung the rifle up and fired without thinking. The man jerked sideways, his shot going wide. Her knees buckled at the recoil, but she kept moving. A deep, cracking sound rippled under the ice. Her stomach dropped. "Don't stop," she hissed to her boy, but he'd already heard it too. The groaning protest of ice under weight. The wolves darted ahead to the far bank, leaping onto solid snow. The smallest returned, planting itself behind her and the boy as another shot whistled past. They made the final stretch in a blur of breath and fear, stumbling into the cover of the trees just as the ice behind them gave way in a dark, gaping wound. The river swallowed the sound of their footsteps, but the hunters' shouts carried over, promising they weren't done yet. The trees swallowed them in darkness, the air thick with pine and the lingering sting of gunpowder. She half dragged, half carried her boy deeper into the woods until her legs burned. The torn ear gray stayed ahead, never looking back, while the smallest wolf ran tight circles around them, ears twitching at every sound. Finally, the pack slowed, and she saw it. A low, snow-covered mound pressed against a rise in the earth. At first, it looked like nothing more than a windbreak, but as she stepped closer, she spotted the entrance. A narrow gap shielded by spruce boughs. The torn ear gray slipped inside without hesitation. She crouched, ducking in after it, the boy close at her heels. Inside, the space was larger than it seemed from outside, dug deep into the earth, the walls reinforced with logs, the smell of old smoke lingering. This wasn't a den. It was a human shelter. A fire pit lay cold in the center, stones blackened with soot. Pelts lined one wall, folded and clean, and on a rough shelf above them sat a carved wooden figure of a wolf, its eyes painted bright amber. Her boy stared at it, wide-eyed. "Mama, I've seen that before." She knelt beside him, whispering, "Where?" He hesitated, then said, "One of the men who kept me. He wore it on a string. Said it belonged to the one they were hunting." She turned sharply toward the smallest wolf, who sat at the far side of the shelter, watching them. In the flicker of moonlight from the doorway, she saw something around its neck, a strip of rawhide, and hanging from it, half of the same carved figure. Her breath caught. The torn ear gray padded closer, its gaze fixed on her, not aggressive but deliberate. In that moment she understood. The smallest wasn't just part of the pack. It was marked, tied to something the hunters wanted badly enough to risk killing every wolf in their way. The boy's hand tightened in hers. "Mama, they said if they caught it, they'd find the treasure." Before she could ask more, a sound outside cut through the stillness, the muffled crunch of boots in snow. Not many. 2, maybe 3. The smallest wolf's ears pricked, and it slipped toward the entrance, silent as shadow. The torn ear gray blocked her path with its body, as if telling her to stay hidden. She pressed her boy close against the wall, heart pounding as voices drifted in. Low, confident, and far too close. The voices grew clearer, laced with the crunch of slow, deliberate steps. She could make out 2 men, their tone smug, as if they already knew they'd cornered their prey. The boy buried his face against her coat, and she could feel the rapid beat of his heart through the worn fabric. The torn ear gray stood at the doorway, tail stiff, shoulders squared, its body blocking the moonlight. The smallest wolf slipped into the shadows near the back of the shelter, barely visible, its amber eyes fixed on the entrance. A boot crunched just outside. Then another. The spruce boughs shifted, and the first man ducked inside, his rifle sweeping across the dark. His face was sharp and wind-burned, his smile quick when he saw her. "Told you she'd run to the animals," he called over his shoulder. The second man followed, a pistol in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. "We'll take the kid first, then the marked one." She rose slowly, keeping herself between them and the boy. "You're not taking anything." The first man laughed, stepping forward, and the torn ear gray lunged. The force knocked him back into the snow outside, his rifle clattering away. The second man raised his pistol, but the smallest wolf shot forward, a blur of fur and teeth, its jaws closing around his wrist. The gun went off, deafening in the small space, the bullet splintering a log near her head. She grabbed the pistol as it fell, shoving the man hard toward the entrance. Outside, snarls and shouts tangled in the night air. She pushed the boy toward the far wall. "Stay low." Then she ducked out into the cold. The first man was on his back, the torn ear gray pinning him down, jaws locked on his coat collar. The second staggered into the open, clutching his bleeding wrist. He saw her, his eyes flashing hate, and lunged, but the smallest wolf darted between them, forcing him to stumble. She raised the pistol, her hands steady despite the adrenaline. "Go," she said, voice low, "or you won't walk away." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the second man spat into the snow, grabbed his partner by the collar, and they backed away toward the trees, vanishing into the darkness. The wolves stayed tense until the forest swallowed the last sound of them. Only then did the torn ear gray turn to her, its muzzle flecked with snow and something darker, and give a low, approving rumble, as if telling her the night wasn't over. But they'd just taken it back. The forest was still again, the snow muffling everything except the soft, rhythmic panting of the wolves. Her boy clung to her coat, his small body trembling, but his eyes stayed locked on the smallest wolf, which sat watching them as if waiting for a decision. The torn ear gray paced near the tree line, its tail flicking with restless energy. She crouched to meet her son's gaze. "It's over now," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't. The hunters would come again, not just for the wolf, but for whatever truth it carried. The boy hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something she hadn't seen before, the other half of the carved wooden wolf figure. "I took it from them," he admitted. "I thought, maybe it would bring me home." Her breath caught as she pieced it together. The smallest wolf's rawhide cord still held its half of the carving, worn smooth from years of movement. She knelt in the snow, holding the boy's piece toward it. The wolf approached slowly, ears twitching, until it was close enough for its breath to warm her fingers. Then, with delicate precision, it touched its muzzle to the carving. The torn ear gray gave a short, approving bark and turned toward the deeper forest, a direction she'd never dared to travel. Her boy's hand slipped into hers. "Mama, I think they want us to follow." She glanced back toward the shelter. Staying meant waiting for the hunters to regroup. Following meant stepping into the unknown. But it was the path the wolves knew. The smallest wolf trotted a few paces ahead, looking back once as if to be sure they were coming. She took a breath, tightened her grip on the pistol, and nodded to her son. "Stay close, and don't look back." They moved into the pines, the snow swallowing their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. The night deepened, but ahead, the wolves moved with certainty, weaving through narrow trails and frozen creeks. Hours later, just as her legs began to fail, they emerged into a hidden valley bathed in faint moonlight. Smoke curled from a fire pit, and along the slope stood weathered cabins, not abandoned but alive, their windows glowing warm. Figures emerged, wrapped in furs, faces kind but wary. A tall man stepped forward, and in the flicker of firelight, she saw the same carved wolf hanging from his neck. He looked from her boy to the smallest wolf, then back to her. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice low, "and you're safe now."